Hi everyone, this is a video for the 7.6 topic, evidence for evolution. So really throughout this video, we're just going to be looking at different ways and qualities that support the idea of evolution, of populations changing over time, and kind of all of the evidence that supports that happening. And so when we look at this, a lot of this can be based off of organisms that have existed in the past. So we're talking about like extinct species. And there are a variety of reasons species can go extinct, right? It could be through the environment is selecting for traits that they have in a population, and so that population can just get wiped out and go extinct. It could be from natural disasters, and it could just be from random chance. There's a thing such as background extinction, where populations can form new species over time, and then through random chance just kind of go away. So there's actually like millions of species that just go extinct kind of naturally, and that's just kind of really when in an environment where traits are selected against, that's going to happen usually more times often than not. And then we also have extant species, which is just referring to species that are still in existence. And so we're going to be talking about how both of those can lead into our understanding of changing over time. So first thing we're going to take a look at is geographical location of living things, also extinct things like fossils. And so we look at characteristics of a habitat or land area, and we can see similarities between them across the world. So llamas, for example, originated closer to North America, and then we have some populations that traveled south to South America. And then when Alaska and Russia were closer together, maybe an ice bridge formed where they could migrate into Asia and Europe and then into Africa, each members of the camel family changing and adapting to the environment that they are living in. We have fossil evidence of this, and we also have up-to-date camel evidence of this. So we do this with all of these different families of species to basically see how they've changed over time and under what pretenses. So geographical is first. Next one is geological. So this is really looking at fossil records. And so we're basically taking the features of the earth over time. We're looking at different surfaces of the earth, right? Because different sediments and minerals will get placed on top of each other over time based on the time period that it's from. And we can kind of go back and look at those different layers. And we can look at the fossils that existed in those layers to see what was around at the same time as each other. Right, so these fossils help us document change over time. We're talking millions and millions of years. And so these remains or impressions can really tell us a story from the past and what used to kind of dominate the niches that were around back then. And so we can date these fossils. So there's a variety of dating mechanisms that we can use to figure out how old something is. This is also called radiometric dating. So this kind of goes back into more chemistry things, if you remember like the half-life of something. But there are these isotopes, right? Isotopes, elements with a different number of neutrons. So carbon, for example, the main carbon is, there's like carbon 12, carbon 13, and carbon 14. And so we can look at these carbon isotopes and they can start decaying over time. And how quickly they decay or at what level of decay they're at will tell us how long ago they existed or were alive. And so it's not just carbon. Carbon dating is kind of like the most common one that we often hear about in the news or at museums or anything like that. But it's really any element that we can find in organisms, in fossils, we can use to date things. So that includes potassium, argon, uranium. And if you look over here, we can kind of see like different types of radiometric dating can take us to different time periods around the world. So some can be between like carbon is like 1 to 70,000 years ago. So this is good for like things like just older fossils and mammals, things like that. Potassium argon dating, this can go back a whole billion years. And so we also do this not just for life and the earth, but we do this for like the universe to figure out how old like the sun is, or stars, solar systems within the galaxy, and even the universe. And so this is kind of a way for us to track those living things and where they're found in the different layers of the rock and figure out how old they are. Right, and so we can take these fossils and compare them. We can see like the evolution of the whale here, how mammals, this population of mammals over, again, millions, hundreds of thousands of years, have been selected for to become entirely aquatic. And so they're no longer adapted to survive on land. They're exclusively water-based. And so we can see those changes over time in the fossils that we've collected over the years. All right, and then next is just physical. So this is just kind of more basic observations that you see in living things. The phenotype of the species, this can actually sometimes lead you down the wrong path, where if two things look the same, they might not actually be as closely related as we think they are. So this is kind of like an older based form of evidence where we used to use this, but now we kind of know, being able to look at their DNA and being able to look at fossils, we can actually know like that's not like our foolproof way to figure out how things are closely related. It's probably our least helpful, to be honest. But we can look at different living things like these seahorses. We can see all of these camouflage adaptations, right? This is cool how they can just like blend in almost perfectly with the environment that they live in. And so this has to take a long time, right? The coral that they survive in has to be like that for a long period of time for seahorses to have traits that almost perfectly camouflage into their environment. So there's physical, there's morphology. So that's also kind of not outdated, but kind of more of a last resort, where we look at the shape of living things or their structures and compare how much of them are similar. And that leads us into homologous structures, which we've already talked about. Basically looking at similar structures in organisms to denote a common ancestor, right? We can look at the homologous structures of mammals to see the bones that we have in common and kind of how those species have adapted those structures over time to better fit into their environment or to be more successful in their environment over time. All right, so the functions of them have changed over the years, but the structures are very similar, if not the same. Okay, another evidence for evolution, we got vestigial structures. So these are features that organisms today no longer use. They no longer serve a purpose, but they denote a common ancestor that used to have that function or use a function for that thing. So for example, snakes have been found to have some bone structures for legs in them. We have seen the anatomy of whales have a hip bone in them, even though they don't have legs. Whales also have finger bones. Dolphins have finger bones, porpoises, right? So these don't have any actual purpose in their current individuals today, but those finger bones came from common ancestors that were land-based mammals that needed those, right? And then humans have them as well, right? Tailbone, right? So we have this area by our hips where common ancestors like primates or monkeys and chimps have a tail coming from here. And so we no longer have that, and so it's just called a vestigial structure. Next up is another term we've seen before. This is called analogous structures. So these are structures that look the same across species, but have evolved separately from distantly related ancestors. So these are not coming from the same common ancestors. They're converging onto them, right? We've talked about convergent evolution. And so these are things that look the same or similar traits. And that's entirely from same or similar environments or environmental pressures. And so we can look at streamlinedness in aquatic animals, fish, dolphins, birds, like penguins. They all have this kind of like torpedo-esque shape to them. that helps them move through the pressure of the water, because there's going to be things that they can better navigate under the gravity and pressure of the water as they move throughout it. So kind of moving on from that, next one is kind of one of the most important ones, biochemical. So this has become more recent technology that has helped us understand how closely related living things are. And so we can look at the DNA and proteins to show how similar organisms are. Right? Proteins, we can look at the amino acids in the same part of molecules. And so, for example, humans, horses, gorillas, chimps, zebras, we can kind of see like humans have this in common with gorillas and chimps, not the same as horses and zebras, right? They have all of these commonalities with all of them. But we start to see like humans have two differences with other living things like a zebra and horses. And so like chimps are our most closely related one. If we were trying to make like a cladogram off of this, chimps would be one, gorillas would be our next most closely related thing on this list, followed by kind of horses and zebra are tied for third, and that they're both distantly related from us. And so amino acids can definitely be used as a way to understand relatedness, but it's not the most useful, because at the end of the day, if we really wanted to know how specifically related we are to something, we use DNA. Right? DNA has more specific sequences, and so we know that different DNA sequences can lead to the same amino acid. And so amino acids is a very helpful way to figure out relatedness, but it is not the most helpful way. For that, we have to look at those DNA sequences. And we have to think about, too, the fact that most of our DNA sequences don't actually code for proteins. The majority of the DNA kind of just takes up space as a way to kind of protect those genes that we have in our sequences from mutations or from just like degradation. And so the structure and the functional evidence supports relatedness of organisms in different domains. And so we can look at DNA and RNA. We can look at processes, right? The fact that all things, for example, need energy. And so they use glycolysis, right? There's also, all living things have a membrane, right? DNA and ribosomes. Remember, there's kind of like three things. And so we look at different structural things in cells and in other living things that we see, all of these have the same, not just the same structures and functions, but they have the same genetic basis too, meaning they have the same exact sequence of DNA that other living things have, meaning or suggesting that they have a common ancestor, right? And we have to kind of remember too, that we're talking about 3.7 billion years. So that's a long time for DNA to change and for populations to change and migrate and change again, and then to kind of natural disasters happen to reset it and then change again. So it's hard to kind of put into full scale, but we have to try our best, right? The tree of life kind of continually and is always diverging and changing from each other based on the environment. Okay, and then our last one is the one we kind of left off with our last topic, which is mathematical. So we can use calculations and statistics to kind of illustrate our idea of if evolution is happening in populations, right? Hardy-Weinberg is to determine if the allele frequencies is changing. Remember, Hardy-Weinberg is equilibrium is only happening in populations that are not evolving. And so we have to kind of be careful about this. We can look at alleles changing over time in a population. We can try to predict why it's changing, whether it's from an environmental pressure, or maybe it's from a random event because it's a small population. But Hardy-Weinberg kind of helps us put that in perspective to see how it changes over time and whether or not that population is changing, and will that lead to a new species. So those are kind of like the 7 or 8 broad evidences of evolution, and I hope that was helpful.